tego typu. Zagramy sobie w Path of Exile. Nie wiem, może w tle coś sobie puścimy tego typu. Fatherland Classic. Hasdro. Miśka. Gen Z. Gocki kurhan. Nie wiem co tu obejrzeć, kurwa mać, tak szczerze. Ruda tańczy jak szalona. Krzyczy, piszczy, to jest ona. I miss my wife, but my aim's getting better. Come on, bruh. Rise and fall.
Welcome to the
Obejrzmy sobie to, myślę. Path of Exile oczywiście. A to by musiał kurwa jakoś, czekajcie, chwila. Sekundka.
colleagues from Greenwood Entertainment had a dream to make their own game. Alex Brueggemann, Steven Noel, Tom Putski and Michael Fogger. Their idea was to make the world's best
Michael.
game, so they certainly didn't
Michał
lack
Chorzy.
ambition. What they did lack though is the technology and the manpower for such an ambitious project. This is where three students from the University of Oldenburg show up and present their brand new game engine. These guys were eternally known as mad scientists. The developers of this engine were huge fans of Ultima
Finster.
Underworld and they wanted to make a similar game. However, Mike Hogge had another idea. He wanted to make a game similar to Ultima 7, but in 3D. The three students thought that idea was absolutely crazy because it's way too ambitious. But Mike was hell-bent on creating his dream game, and he eventually managed to convince them to join the team. They scrapped the idea for a new Ultima Underworld-inspired game and started working on something entirely different. Shortly after this, the four colleagues left Greenwood Entertainment in order to create a brand new studio. They named the studio Piranha Bytes Software. Piranha Bytes had around 40 people in the studio when they started the full production on their first game. One of the
Kurwa,
first
co? Jak
things
to
they
można
did
nazwać?
was licensing the game engine. They named it Zengen, and they're going to use and improve this engine for the first two games. Zengen allowed Piranha Bytes to start working on the first game. In 1998, Bert Speckles, one of the mad scientists behind the creation of Zengen, suggested to change the name of the upcoming game to Gothic. It sounded appropriate for the dark atmosphere that the game was trying to create, and it was easily pronounceable in general. Gothic was in development from 1997 to...
No, to się miało nazywać jakoś Orfeusz, z tego co kojarzę.
Somewhat troubling. The direction of the game changed more than a couple of times, and some major features were scrapped. Cutting content is not unusual in game development, but Piranha Bytes had some big features that never made it to the final release, like the multiplayer mode. The multiplayer mode was supposed to work with up to 4 other players, and you could beat the entire game like this. Even though the netcode was working fine in the early stages of development, this game mode was scrapped only 9 months before the game released. The team then decided to fully focus on delivering a single-player, story-driven RPG. A ton of work has been put into the engine itself, which is quite apparent from the various segments of the release version of the game. Gothic could feature a seamless 3D open world with almost no loading screens at all, except a couple of big dungeons. This was unheard of in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially for an RPG. On the other side, 80% of the game's sexual content was done in the last 4 months of development. Things like combat AI, most of dialogue and quests, even the daily routines of NPCs were done in the last 4 months of development. Mike Hogge said that he was sad when they had to release Gothic because he thought it was still unfinished, especially when it comes to side content in later chapters. He recently talked about this in one of his lectures about the game design.
And the main part of the story, about 80% of the game, literally, not the technical programming, that was ongoing in the engine development and all that. But the content of the game was done, 80% was done in the last 4 months, actually. The combat AI, most of the dialogues, most of the quests, and so forth, even the daily routines. We got all the systems in place, and then we had a plan, and then we just executed it with like, I don't know, 80-hour weeks.
Gothic officially came out in Germany first, on 15th March in 2001. 7 months later it came out in Europe, and a month after that in North America. This game was not a smashing success upon release. We don't exactly know how many copies it sold, but Gothic quickly started getting a cult-like following in Europe. The game offered a very unique RPG experience that you couldn't find anywhere else. A small but very dense open world with almost no loading screens, a lot of player freedom and choice, realistic NPC behavior, down-to-earth fantasy setting, amazing sense of progression, and so on. All of that combined with an amazing soundtrack made the game extremely immersive. The user interface had a minimalistic design for the same reason. Almost nothing got in the way of experiencing this realistic and
Triona,
fantasy
XD.
world. Gothic was designed to be played with a keyboard only, which was a weird decision even back in 2001. When
No.
you get used to this awkward control scheme, it started feeling very intuitive actually. Despite some of the bugs and awkward controls, Gothic managed to score some favorable reviews all around. After they successfully released the first game, Piranha Bytes was split into 2 teams. One team started working on a new sci-fi shooter that had nothing to do with Gothic.
Stawaj, Anłyna.
The team worked on the add-on for Gothic that was named Gothic Sequel. Gothic Sequel was supposed to continue the story of Gothic 1, but they only managed to complete 1 chapter of the game before they scrapped this project
Burning
in favor
Arrow.
of the
Keyboard
actual
tutorials.
sequel.
Oczywiście.
I made a whole video about unreleased Gothic Sequel, so feel free to check that out if you're interested. Piranha Bytes wanted to make Gothic 2 bigger and better, so they scrapped the Gothic Sequel expansion. Gothic 2 was in development for only 11 months. This was only possible because they decided to continue working with the same game engine. However, some notable improvements have been made with the engine.
Wow.
Gothic 2 had better visuals in general. The models had a higher poly count, the textures were more detailed, and the draw distance was higher. Gothic 2 used DirectX 8, which had better lighting and water. The dynamic night and day cycle was back, and it looked even better because of these graphical improvements. The world could be explored with no loading screens at all, except when you want to access the DLC zone. For some reason, Piranha Bytes didn't have high hopes for Gothic 2. They didn't expect the game to do well, but but to their surprise, the game managed to sell 100k copies before its international release. 29th November was the official release date in Germany. Europe and North America had to wait a bit longer for Gothic 2. Gothic 2 was met with great reception all around. It was an amazing sequel in general, and it improved a lot of things from the first game. It was bigger, more open-ended, and even less linear than Gothic 1. While most of the team started working on the next game in the series, 5 people were assigned to work on the expansion pack for Gothic 2 called Night of the Raven. Bjorn Pankratz was the leader of the team for Night of the Raven. The development of the expansion didn't take long at all because they already had most of the assets. There were many unused assets from the Gothic sequel project that was scrapped, which saw the light of the day in the Gothic 2 expansion. Piranha Bytes released Night of the Raven in 2003 in Germany. The rest of the game world
fucking
had to
free.
wait for 2 years before Night of the Raven would reach the shelves. Night of the Raven added a brand new location to the game and a very decent amount of content. It was undoubtedly a very good addition to the game. It was also considerably harder than the base game. Night of the Raven didn't only add new content, it also rebalanced the entire game. It made the game considerably harder in general, and it seamlessly added some new content in old locations of Gothic 2. Nowadays, the gold edition of Gothic 2 comes with the expansion pack and all these changes by default. In my personal opinion, there is no reason to go back to the original Gothic 2 version, but not all fans will agree with this. Nevertheless, the fans were very happy with Knights of the Raven expansion in general, and it only made Gothic 2 even more legendary. Piranha Bytes actually had some plans for another Gothic 2 expansion. Together with the publisher Joe Wood, they started looking for a subcontractor that will work on another expansion, but none of the studios reached the expectations of Piranha Bytes. From this point on, they will focus entirely on the next big installment in the Gothic series. Mike Hogge and the big part of the team were already working on Gothic 3. Gothic 3 was an insanely ambitious game for the time. The plan was to have a fully open world with 3 big continents, and to achieve this, they needed to find a new engine. They had their eye on the Gamebryo engine, which Bethesda used for the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. But Gamebryo wasn't capable of loading a free open world with arbitrary meshes, and it wasn't sufficient for all the requirements.
Właśnie nie wiem, w którą to stronę pójść.
This
Damage
meant
with
the
balls.
Piranha Bytes needed to develop another engine which will support their vision for the sequel. They named it Genome Engine. Even though
Chyba w to
Genome
pójdę,
Engine
nie?
was capable of creating an amazing open world full with detailed and unique assets, it was clear that Piranha Bytes needed a lot more time to finish the development. It proved to be an insanely ambitious project for a small team. Gothic 3 was delayed for roughly a year, but that wasn't enough to fix all the issues with the engine and the game itself. The publisher Joe Wood couldn't bear the financial burden anymore, and the game had to be released in October 2006. The released version of the game had ton of bugs, and some of them were straight up game breaking. The performance of the game was terrible in general. Piranha Bytes knew that the game wouldn't be free of bugs on release, but they underestimated the extent of the problem. Gothic 3 was a technical failure. To make things even worse,
Ja pamiętam, kurwa.
finished in a couple of major
Ja
errors.
wchodziłem do Redok, to praktycznie połowa Redok to była... ja też miałem chujową kartę, nie oszukujmy się, ale była taka zgliczowana, nie? Takie białe tekstury były.
Piranha Bytes started working on several patches, which released some days before Christmas 2006. This was the first time when publisher Joe Wood and Piranha Bytes started having some big disagreements. Piranha Bytes had a plan to improve Gothic 3 by improving the engine itself,
Odpaliło go.
the story and the gameplay. But their plan was to start working on the add-on and eventually include these improvements to the base game in future patches. On the other hand, Joe Wood demanded a massive patch from Piranha Bytes instead, which led to the separation of these two companies in 2007. Piranha Bytes found a new publisher in Koch Media's gaming label, Deep Silver. Joe Wood got a temporary right to use the Gothic IP for several years. They got to make a mobile Gothic 3 game called The Beginning, Forsaken Gods, the standalone game that continued the story of Gothic 3, Gothic 4 Arcania, and The Fall of Setarif, the add-on for Arcania.
Full of shit
On a
riff.
completely different front, the fans realized that getting more patches for Gothic 3 was out of the question. The community patches for Gothic 3 started rolling out frequently, and eventually they fixed 99% of the bugs in the game. But that wasn't enough for the game to run without any technical issues like micro stutters. Fast forward to 2021, we got to see a parallel universe patch, which finally fixed these annoying technical issues with the game. Underneath all of those issues, you could still see that this was a Piranha Bytes game at its core, and even more than that. The handcrafted open world was filled with dense vegetation,
Ciekły ork
a lot of
bijący
unique
zło.
assets, and Gothic 3 is a very pretty game, even by today's standards. The 3 big locations gave the game a much needed visual variety. The number of populated locations on the map was staggering. They were not just copy and pasted, all of them had a unique design. They were filled with various NPCs that have their own daily schedules, and the game world seemed very much alive. It also felt like a proper sandbox RPG where you can interact with all NPCs individually or collectively, which allowed you to create huge unscripted fights and behaviors. For better or worse, but mostly for the worse to be honest, because the game would start tanking the FPS like crazy in those situations back in the day. Mike Hogg said the Gothic 3 would be just fine if they had at least a couple of more months of development. Considering that 80% of the content from Gothic 1 was done in the last 4 months of development, I can see how this would be possible. It's worth mentioning that Mike doesn't only blame Joe Wood for the poor technical state of Gothic 3 on release.
Galvanic Arrow.
Gothic 3 is fully playable today with a small amount of community patches which fix the unfinished parts of the game. Even so, I personally think this game is very immersive and fun to play even today. Unfortunately, this was the beginning of the end for the Gothic IP, and it would only get worse. Joe Wood had a moderate success with the Gothic 3 mobile game, but that clearly wasn't the main targeted audience for Gothic titles. A very experienced team got to work on this title, and it got some very good reviews.
Kurwa.
Sadly, that wasn't the case with the add-on for Gothic 3. Joe Wood hires a very inexperienced development team called Shrine Games to create a standalone game with Gothic 3 engine and assets.
A to w Mumbai jakieś ziomki ta. I to jakieś kurwa. Chłoposzki, jakieś studenciki. A tu mamy swoją tą. Nie, na razie to. Garniemy tu.
Forsaken Gods continued the story of Gothic 3, but the quality of content was nowhere near what we got used to from Piranha Bytes, even compared to the base game of Gothic 3. Forsaken Gods only sold around 20k copies upon release, and it would later get a huge patch which fixed almost all technical issues. Joe Wood had another chance to make a game in the Gothic universe. Gothic 4 Arcania came out in 2010. This game was a solid action-adventure, but it had little to no resemblance to previous Gothic games, even though it had the Gothic in its title, which later got removed when the license went back to Piranha Bytes, and nowadays it's only called Arcania. Piranha Bytes temporarily lost the license for the Gothic IP, so they needed to make something entirely new. Despite all the problems with the Genome engine and Gothic 3, their game was based on the same but improved engine. It was largely reprogrammed, and it wasn't officially called the Genome engine anymore. They were not going to make the same mistake like with Gothic 3, so they focused a lot more on the quality control for the next title to ensure the smoothest possible release. They wanted to impress the new publisher, but more importantly, restore some of the lost respect from the Gothic fans. The name of the new game was Risen, which seemed appropriate for more than a couple of reasons. Piranha Bytes listened to the feedback more seriously this time around, and they decided to make a modern Gothic 2 basically. Risen was certainly not as ambitious as Gothic 3, but it was exactly what the fans of Piranha Bytes needed. A polished RPG which offers a very similar experience to earlier Gothic titles. Risen came out in 2009, and this was the first Piranha Bytes game that got a console version as well. Unfortunately, the Xbox 360 port wasn't very good to say the least. Visually, the PC version looked like a different game, and the performance was very bad on Xbox 360. Nevertheless, Risen got some pretty good reviews in general, and to this day, it's one of the best games from Piranha Bytes. The player gets a very interesting
Risen, no taki...
and a couple of factions to
To nie jest
join,
gothic,
which
tylko
mostly
takie no...
resemble the old factions
Jak nie masz
in
co
Diablo
robić,
2.
to sobie możesz zagrać, tak
This
szczerze.
medieval fantasy setting felt very similar to old Piranha Bytes games. Risen was not exactly on the same level like earlier Gothic games, but it was very close to that. With a brand new IP on their hands and a very decent first game in the series, it was only logical to start working on the sequel. Risen 2 Dark Waters
Ogre.
came out in 2012 on PC, Xbox 360 and for the first time ever on PlayStation 3. Somewhere in the middle of Reason's 2 development, Mike Hogge left the studio. In 2018 on Kai Rosekran's stream, Mike said that one of the main reasons why he left is because he felt like they're making the same game over and over again and he desperately needed a break. There is no doubt that Mike was a mastermind behind the legendary Gothic series. The lack of his presence in the team has noticeably affected each and every title that Piranha Bytes produced after his departure. Mike was working on a sci-fi game called Space Time back in 2018, but it seems like that project was cancelled after his studio failed to secure the publisher in time. Jon Pankratz took over the role of project director in Piranha Bytes Studio. He and his wife Jenny would become
O,
the
to
key
trochę
people
pojebali,
for
no.
years to
Powiem, że
come.
nie.
Risen 2 turned out to be a very disappointing title in general. They tried to flip the script once again by introducing a bigger open world, which was separated by multiple islands you can explore. However, the game
Kurwa, jakie mam
suffered from a
ściny
very
jebane jakieś.
simplistic combat system, as well as the lackluster RPG features. The sudden switch to a new setting, which was hyper-focused on pirates,
Kurwa
was
jest.
also a bit awkward, to say the least. It wasn't completely surprising because you could always meet some pirates in the previous game, and even Gothic 2 had a lot of pirate characters. So it didn't exactly come out of nowhere, but it felt like a big change in the game direction. But Risen 2 had a lot of half-baked features, which made the game feel unfinished in certain areas. The console ports also suffered a similar fate to Risen 1, unfortunately. It seemed like Piranha Bytes tried to make a more casual action-adventure with a pirate setting, which would be fine if the game was more fun to play. I personally think that Risen 2 is the weakest game that Piranha Bytes ever released, and I guess a lot of people would agree.
No ja grałem w dwójkę i trójkę też grałem w Risena, nie? Ale to takie kurwa było. Jak grałem w to już żeby tak skończyć, żeby mieć to odbębnione.
As always, further improvements have been made on the engine, even though the game didn't exactly look like it uses the latest technology. Piranha Bytes had some very exciting promotional material for Risen 3. The trailer called Back to the Roots was very exciting, because it showcased everything that Piranha Bytes fans wanted to see. It had a similar pirate setting, but they also expanded the setting with more factions, which brought the old fantasy medieval vibe. Risen 3 also had the same islands to explore, but most of them were expanded in a way, and the exploration felt much better in general. The exploration in Risen 2 felt a lot more linear compared to the final entry in the series. Risen 3 vastly improved the exploration, even though it technically used the same map. However, Risen 3 turned out to be a pretty mediocre game in general.
Kurwa.
But neither Risen 3 nor Risen 2 ever managed to come close to the quality of the first game in the Risen series. On the bright side, the console versions were a lot better compared to the previous games, because Piranha Bytes worked closely with the studio that was porting the game. The new generation of consoles just came out, which also helped with making these RPGs more stable in general, because of the more processing power. After Risen 3, Piranha Bytes would once again try to reinvent themselves by creating a totally new IP. Somewhere close to the release of the last Risen game, Piranha Bytes got the rights for the Gothic IP back from Joe Woods. So naturally, a lot of fans were hoping to see another Gothic title after this, but Piranha Bytes was already developing a brand new game. ELX was a chance for a new beginning, a sci-fi RPG with a huge open world, which was almost 2 times bigger than Gothic 3. Now that sounds extremely ambitious for a small team, which immediately raised some concerns.
Co się kurwa dzieje? Nie wiem.
Happened the last time they tried to make a huge open world. However, ELX didn't have a lot of technical issues upon release. The game itself, though, was met with a mixed reception. The rough combat system was the main problem with a lot of people. The combat system in Risen 3 felt way smoother in general, and it arguably had better animations, although that game suffered from the lack of
Ja
challenge.
pierdolę.
Elex felt like a much harder game, even on easy difficulty, up to the point where a lot of people consider it to be almost unplayable because it's very punishing. On top of that, the controls in Elex felt very sluggish, which was one of the main reasons for the underwhelming combat. However, the exploration was stellar. They included a brand new method of exploring this vertical huge open world. The jetpack was a perfect tool for exploring every nook and cranny in this huge, diverse and vertical open world. Many other features like multiple factions to join closely resemble older Piranha Bytes games. Overall, it seemed like Elex was a solid beginning of a new IP.
Oh, and don't say our flash technology around. I don't expect any more or less from you.
In 2019, THQ Nordic acquires Piranha Bytes and all of their IPs. Not even a year after this, THQ announces a remake for Gothic with a playable teaser on Steam. 90% of the players were in favor for a remake, even though the playable teaser itself was met with mixed reception. THQ hires Alkima Interactive, a studio based in Spain, to work on the remake. We don't know a lot about this studio, but they are closely following the feedback from the fans. Piranha Bytes started working on Elex 2 right after the first game got released. After the first announcement trailer for Elex 2 in 2021, it was obvious that the production value for the game went up, at least when it comes to the trailer itself and every other trailer that you're going to see after this one. For the first time ever, a game from Piranha Bytes had a pretty strong marketing campaign. Even so, Elex 2 didn't manage to come even close to the number of concurrent players that Elex 1 reached when it released. This is only Steam numbers, we don't have any console data for the sales and concurrent players, but still, it's a big piece of the pie. Elex 2 had a very similar reception to Elex 1, although a lot of fans would say that the first game was superior in general. The most obvious change was the artistic style, which made some old locations in the game almost unrecognizable. Elex 2 open world lacked the visual variety of the first game, although the exploration itself was still pretty fun. Combat felt way smoother, and it was improved in a couple of ways. But the biggest gameplay improvement was the jetpack. It was way more flexible, which is great, but that also changed how I explored the world for better or worse. A lot of fans seem to like Elex 1 more for various reasons, even though Elex 2 improved a lot of technical features. Right after Elex 2 came out, Piranha Bytes started working on the final entry in the series. Wiki 6 was the code name on German's government funding page, which is supposed to be Elex 3. But Piranha Bytes started struggling a lot after 2022. THQ Nordic, the publisher of Piranha Bytes games, is owned by Embracer. Embracer ran into trouble in 2023 after a $2 billion investment deal fell apart. They started closing down various beloved studios, and it seemed like Piranha Bytes will suffer the same fate. Bjorn and his wife Jenny left the company in November 2023, which was another huge red flag. Fast forward to January 2024, Piranha Bytes addresses the rumors and they confirm the unfortunate situation. But there was still hope. THQ was doing everything in their power to try and find another publisher that will buy out
Orbs
Piranha Bytes.
of transmutation.
Financing from Embracer was enough to support the team until June 2024. June came and went, and Piranha Bytes was still without a new publisher. Then we got a couple of very sad pictures from the empty studio in July. We still didn't get any official statement for the closure of the studio. That's because the studio will most likely not release any official statements, allowing itself to depart peacefully and quietly. But their games will never be forgotten. Gothic 1 and 2 recently
Nie.
got a port to Nintendo Switch.
No już dobra, wchodzimy.
Both of these ports had some problems upon release. THQ's marketing was misleading
Tidal
in a
Island.
way. But both of these games play wonderfully on the Switch, and they are arguably the best way to experience Gothic 1 and 2 nowadays. The controller support is great, and the games look pretty good, with somewhat shaky performance here and there. THQ said that the patch with some of the updates, like the controller support, should hit the PC version eventually. Gothic still lives, and it will continue to live through the amazing community. The modding scene has always been extremely active, not only when it comes to the patches. The Chronicles of Montana Archalos has been a huge fan project, which finally released in 2021. It's like a love letter to Gothic 2, it's a standalone game that every Gothic fan should try out. We'll probably never get to see Elex 3, unless a miracle happens. In the meantime, Bjorn Pankratz and his wife Jenny founded a new game studio, and they will continue making games. Pithead Studio is going to focus on smaller indie titles, which will hopefully have the same charm like previous Piranha Bytes games. Gothic, Reason and Elex IPs will stay with THQ Nordic until further notice. We have Gothic Remake to look forward to, and hopefully this game will continue the legendary legacy of Gothic RPGs. I will always remember and play Piranha Bytes RPGs. These games are a huge part of who I am as a gamer, and this channel probably wouldn't exist without them. So huge thanks to each and every member that worked in Piranha Bytes in the last 20 years. Anyway, tell me what you think about the closure of the studio in the comments below. What is your favorite game for Piranha Bytes? If you guys want to check out these games for the first time, be sure to use my GOG affiliate link.
GOP motherfuckerski.
Thanks to all my channel members and Patreons. If you like these videos, consider becoming a channel supporter and you'll get some special perks. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads, and I'll see you in the next one.
The Empire's citizens decorate our meeting houses with their heads. Our warriors build homes for our families. Our families till the earth, fish the waters, fill the air with song. The card we wave is yet a seedling here, but it grows, gains in pride and power every day.
Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. 2006 was an amazing year for gaming in general. A ton of quality titles from basically all genres saw the release date during this year. Titan Quest was definitely not that big of a release compared to some of these industry giants, but the reception of this game was pretty good. But apparently it was not good enough for THQ, the publisher for the game, to greenlit the sequel to Titan Quest, which was actually in development. The reception from
THQ Nordic.
The game was praised for phenomenal replay value, very solid gameplay, and amazing presentation.
You shall find your answer.
Some of the major critiques for the game were related to bare bones online play and the lack of originality, because Titan Quest is just another Diablo 2 clone. But I think both of those arguments are kinda redundant. Even though this game has an online co-op mode, it's very clear that the main focus is on single-player experience.
Psychology professor.
And I think there is nothing wrong with that. As for the quote-unquote shameless Diablo clone argument that some critics used back then, well, I guess people still didn't realize that Diablo created a brand new subgenre of RPGs. That narrative was quick to change in the following years, because we got to see a lot more of these quote-unquote shameless Diablo clones.
Kurwa, nie, przy tych bossach mi się tak pierdoli.
Received a huge expansion called Immortal Throne. It was a great addition to the base game because it added some new content and made some great changes to the gameplay in general. Even though the reception of the base game and the expansion was pretty good, Iron War Entertainment, the studio behind Titan Quest, had to close down because of the inability to secure funding for its next project. Like I said, Titan Quest 2 was supposed to be a thing, but at the time, THQ believed that PC gaming
And
was
this in
dead,
chess,
and
which
that
I-
top-down
okay.
action RPGs were antiquated.
In bed,
Yeah,
to...
real. If you watched my retrospective video for Grim Dawn last year, you might remember me talking about this. I was lucky enough to get this exclusive info from Arthur Bruno, the CEO of Create Entertainment. Studio for Grim Dawn, the spiritual successor to Titan Quest. When the pitch for Titan Quest 2 failed, they tried to make another game that's more focused on action combat, and that game was supposed to be called Black Legion. According to Arthur Bruno, Black Legion had a third-person camera and more action-oriented fighting system with various brutal finishing moves. THQ greenlit this project, but suddenly they dropped the project because they acquired Big Huge Games, who were working on a big budget RPG. Big Huge Games is the studio behind Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, by the way.
Your foolishness knows no bounds.
Shortly after this, Iron Lore had to close down, but THQ suffered a similar fate. They got acquired by Nordic Games and assumed the name THQ Nordic, the publisher company that's still very active today. A couple of key people from Iron Lore, like Arthur Bruno, created a brand new development studio called Create Entertainment and managed to secure the funding for the new RPG called Grim Dawn on Kickstarter. That's a quite interesting story behind the studio and the publisher of Titan Quest, but there is a happy ending behind the story after all. Grim Dawn is basically a spiritual successor to Titan Quest, and even Black Legion is not completely off the table. It might still happen someday in the future. At least that's one of the things which Arthur Bruno mentioned when I got in touch with him. When it comes to Titan Quest, THQ Nordic released some brand new expansions in the past couple of years for this 16 years old game. Full-blown expansions to be more exact. Ragnarok in 2017, Atlantis in 2019, and Eternal Embers in 2021. Only one of those 3 new expansions has mostly positive reviews on Steam, while others have mixed reviews, but we'll get to that eventually. THQ Nordic did a great job with various new patches for the game, quality of life improvements, and they also ported this game to other consoles. This is not so strange when it comes to THQ Nordic. They did a similar thing with Kingdoms of Amalur as well. With that being said, let's go back to the beginning and start talking about the game itself.
You there, soldier! If you've come looking for rest and peace, you won't find it here in Helios.
Before I got to play Titan Quest, top-down action RPGs were never my thing. This game single-handedly changed my mind about Diablo-like RPGs in general. The reason why I decided to try this game out in the first place was the Greek mythology setting and the vibrant color palette. I don't know if this is nostalgia speaking, but there is something very pleasant about this time period when it comes to graphics in RPGs. My 3 most played RPGs from that time period were Oblivion, Gothic 3 and Titan Quest. I think it's not so hard to notice the similarities between these games when it comes to the color palettes. Anyway, Titan Quest is a great example of how the artistic
O,
style
Titan Quest! O, Titan Quest! Czas zagrać, kurwa, kiedy?
why the game aged so well.
Dobra, możemy się wrócić, kurwa, jego beń.
I wouldn't call this art style cartoony, even though it might seem like that, just because of the vibrant colors. It's more of a semi-realistic art style, and it seemed like it was a great design decision, considering how well it stood the test of time. When it comes to the graphical fidelity itself, if you're playing this game on a higher resolution, you're going to see some very crisp textures. To put it this way, if this game came out today, I don't think a lot of people will complain about the visuals. But as always, you can see the true age of these games by just looking at the character models. This aspect of the game is one of those things that didn't age so well, but that's really common for the majority of older RPGs. Some of these character models look really rough, like, what the hell is that?
Everyone asks where the monsters came from. It is clear as day. They were sent by the enemies of the gods.
And some of these animations are really stiff, which makes the game look really goofy at times. Besides that, I think the graphics are more than passable even today, but I'm not a very demanding person when it comes to this game aspects. Playing this game in 4K resolution is just an amazing experience in general. There are some graphical effects which are definitely showing their age as well. The shadows are really simplistic even on the high settings, and even the lighting in general is not all that great. The game has a day and night cycle which changes the mood of locations you're exploring quite a bit. But yeah, the outdated lighting techniques can definitely make the places you explore feel a bit flat, for the lack of a better word. However, like I said, the textures on the environment are really crisp on higher resolutions and higher graphical settings, which makes them really pleasant to look at. Combined with the vibrant color palette, this game still manages to create a warm atmosphere that I personally find very pleasant and relaxing. Even though the main theme of Titan Quest is the Greek mythology, you'll get to visit the variety of different locations through 7 different acts. But even without those 3 new locations from the recent DLCs, the 4 acts of the base game are quite varied. You start in ancient Greece, then you go through Egypt, Orient, which is basically the Far East, with places like India, China and Japan. The Immortal Throne DLC, which is included in the Anniversary Edition by default, takes place in Hades Underworld. So yeah, the locations are really varied and all of them have a unique look, which makes the exploration amazing. That's something which was kinda hard to pull off in an isometric RPG, but having different
Kurwa, no.
locations is not enough to convince the player
Physical
that you're not
resistance.
exploring the same map over and over again in an
Kurwysyny.
isometric RPG. That's where the verticality
Jest ten czas, dobra, mógłbym się cofnąć, bo tutaj widzę kolejny. No. Mogę się cofnąć.
To pull off in an isometric RPG even today, yet alone in 2006. The verticality is not crazy though, but it's just enough to not make the game world feel flat while exploring it. There are some locations where you can take the advantage of this by shooting enemies with ranged abilities or weapons from above. Another big reason why the locations feel so varied is the insane amount of different looking enemy types that you're going to encounter. I think that's really important in every RPG basically, but especially when it comes to these types of games where killing things is like 99% of the game. I don't know how big was the budget for the game, but Titan Quest truly felt like a AAA RPG back then. Every character is fully voice acted, the presentation in general was great, and the game felt complete upon
Kurwa, już jakieś lagi są, kurwa.
the story itself can be described in a similar manner. It's pretty decent for ARPG standards, where you don't need a lot of context for killing things over and over again, and load better gear to kill more stuff on greater difficulty. That being said, I still think the game is worth playing just for the campaign itself, and that's exactly how I played it back then. My perspective was entirely different, and I didn't know exactly what's the deal with these games, and why people tend to replay them on higher difficulties. But I was completely satisfied by just going through the story of the game a couple of times with different characters. And only then I started noticing why it's so satisfying to sink so many hours into these types of games. So if you're not exactly a fan of grinding in Diablo-like RPGs, you can still enjoy this game by just going through the main story. The story itself has a really simple premise. Telkins are trying to release the Titans, which are a great threat to the world. The Telkins are these ancient wizards that you're going to fight throughout the game, and that's pretty much everything you need to know about the story. You're going to fight various creatures from the Greek and different mythologies, as well as regular beasts who are corrupted by the Telkins. There is a plethora of side quests as well, but they're just another cheap excuse to kill some more monsters. That doesn't mean they're not worth doing, because you'll usually get to fight a stronger monster, which has a higher chance to drop something useful. You'll find
Miałem się
yourself
cofnąć,
doing a lot
kurwa.
of side quests by just exploring the map and killing things. The map in Titan Quest is completely open,
Czekajcie,
and it
zrobimy
feels
może
like a true
tak.
open world RPG.
Po punkcie
There's a
aż.
fog of war, which kinda encourages you to explore each and every corner of the map. All maps in the game have a wide areas to explore and a lot of caves. Titan Quest can put a lot of similar games in shape because it doesn't have any loading screens. Whether you're entering cities, open areas or caves, which usually have at least a couple of levels, everything feels completely seamless. Well, that's not entirely true, since I had some noticeable FPS drops while entering caves, which was definitely annoying. For the most part, my PC can run this game on 4K on high settings with no issues, but these frame drops are very consistent when entering and leaving caves for some reason. Speaking of caves, I always liked the design of them. Going through these caves never felt pointless to me, because there is always a nice chance to get some good piece of gear, either from monsters or various chests. Speaking of gear that comes from monsters you kill, there is a very nice attention to detail, which makes the process of looting things a lot more enjoyable in general. Everything you see on a monster will drop when you kill them. Weapons and armors have physical assets, which automatically drop when the monster is killed. This means that you can usually notice a special item on an NPC, and you know you can loot it when you get to kill that particular NPC. I found this extremely satisfying, and it's one of the reasons why I like to play with a more zoomed in camera. I mean, you won't get to miss those items even if you don't pay attention to this, because you'll kill the NPCs regardless and the items will drop. But still, I think it's a really nice attention to detail, which adds a really nice flavor to the gameplay. And speaking of the gameplay, let's start talking about it, finally.
Okej.
The gameplay in Diablo-like action RPG
Moment support.
better compared to some other games in the RPG genre. If killing monsters feels enjoyable by just holding the left mouse button, your game is on a good road to become a decent action RPG. And if you have a good progression
Jeden
system on top
maximum
of that,
life.
which allows you to build and play your character in a lot of different ways, it's not so hard to see why these games have such great longevity. The action gameplay in Titan Quest is not exactly amazing by today's standards, but it still manages to offer a very decent experience. This game plays like pretty much every Diablo-like action RPG. You use your mouse for movement and basic attacks, and you can bind your abilities and consumables to whatever key combination you prefer. Ever since Titan Quest got ported to consoles, it also got a full controller support, obviously. So this time around I really wanted to test the game out with a controller on the PC, and I beat the whole game like that. I didn't have a lot of problems while playing like this, and it was definitely a lot more comfortable experience. But I still prefer playing games of this type with mouse and keyboard because it's usually a lot superior experience. Especially if you're going to play a ranged character, because aiming a ranged weapon feels more natural with the mouse cursor. Same goes for plethora of abilities that require a bit of aiming and positioning. It's kinda easy to mess up your aiming on abilities with a controller, which happened quite often on my playthrough. The thing is, THQ Nordic already has a solution for this problem on console ports. You can simply hold the button for the ability you wish to cast and you'll get this very useful highlight. For some odd reason that's not working on the PC, everything else transfers to a console-like experience when you plug in a controller. Long story short, I recommend playing Titan Quest on PC.
Roll of Wisdom, to mi się przyda.
But the controls
No.
are not the only thing which makes Titan Quest more playable on the PC. What's perhaps the biggest quality of life improvement is the option to increase the game speed. And as far as I'm aware, this option is exclusive to PC. The feel of the gameplay in Titan Quest was always on the slower side, especially in the early game. I never thought this was a huge issue, but this was one of the reasons why the controls can feel a bit unresponsive. The way your character controls in this game was never that snappy. It always felt to me like there was a slight input lag, and the transition between some animations can make the feel of the gameplay a bit clumsy. Especially in this case, when I'm playing a ranged character who is trying to kite enemies and use abilities in a very tight window where I'm trying to not get hit. Instead of pressing the ability button once, I usually feel the need to spam the ability button, especially in these situations. The game speed option is trying to mitigate some of these problems, but it's far from a perfect solution. What's interesting about the Anniversary Edition on PC is the default game speed option. THQ set the game speed on fast by default. So apparently THQ Nordic thought the normal game speed was way too slow for today's standards. Like I said, this is not exactly the best solution for the problem, which THQ tried to fix for a couple of reasons. You can feel a very steep difficulty curve in some cases, and the faster game speed is the main reason for that. Some enemies can simply one-shot you or stun-lock you, and you simply don't have enough time to react, because it can feel extremely fast. I guess it doesn't happen often, but when it does, it can be really frustrating. The normal game speed makes the gameplay a bit more tactical in those situations. But outside of those situations, the normal game speed can feel really sluggish if you got used to the fast game speed, which is on by
Jezus, czemu mi się tak laguje to? Ja pierdolę. Kurwa, Wiedźmina na 40 klatkach chyba na wysokich mam. Kurwa, gram. Ja pierdolę, co się dzieje? Ja pierdolę, za mnie coś pojebie. Kurwa, w koja też mogę zagrać i się za dużo nie dzieje.
So yeah, the normal speed of the game definitely feel a bit slower compared to some newer action RPGs, so I recommend getting this game on the PC if you want to try it out. When it comes to the gameplay itself, dual mastery system is hands down the best part about it. The idea of combining two different masteries however you see fit is amazing. The way it works is pretty simple. You get 3 points to invest in masteries of your choice each time you level up. You can choose to dump those points into the mastery itself, which gives you stat bonuses, or you can invest them in passive and active abilities. But you have to unlock those abilities by investing points into mastery first. It's a lot simpler than it sounds. If you have all DLCs, you have 11 masteries in the game, and you can mix and match them however you want. Each combination of masteries gets a unique name. My character is Pilgrim, which is the combination of hunting and maiden masteries. Some combinations have a much better synergy than others, which is usually more noticeable on higher difficulties. But you can choose to play whatever seems interesting to you and still complete the game on normal difficulty. Speaking about difficulties, Titan Quest is no joke, even on normal difficulty. It heavily depends on your build and especially the gear you manage to obtain, but you can't exactly blast through the whole game on the default difficulty. Even though some parts of the early game could make you believe otherwise, like the moment I got this bow from the Medusa boss. I started shredding enemies left and right with no issues, but after a while my damage was not all that great. This creates a very enjoyable progression system in the game. You can feel your character getting stronger when you level up and get better items, which is really important in pretty much all RPGs. Another reason for that is the lack of aggressive level scaling of enemies. There is still a very small threshold for level scaling on enemies. They can go up to 5 levels or something like that, but that's pretty much it. This also means that if you decide to blast through the main quest, you can find yourself in a slight disadvantage. But that's only the case if you're trying to rush through the game and skip a lot of zones and enemies. I
Augmentation,
really took
no.
my time with this character and I didn't do any grinding actually. But when I got to Hades, which is the fourth act of the game,
Kurwa, on za mnie coś pojebie.
this was mostly because I was not so lucky with the items I got.
Whoa!
Was also a bit lower compared to the enemies here. And my build was not so great either. I just wanted to try.
Would you
out
mind
new
sending
quests.
me a
It
friend
doesn't seem
request?
like an amazing fit with hunting mastery,
Oh man,
but
I'm
still,
quite
the game was
busy now,
perfectly
you know.
manageable with zero grinding for items, at least on the normal difficulty. Titan Quest has some decent boss fights.
You
throughout
can find my Discord
They're not so
server
amazing
in the
compared to boss
description
fights
of
in
my
more
channel.
action RPGs. These boss fights are good enough to offer you some challenge, but don't expect to find some boss mechanics like in Path of Exile or in Lost Ark. It's nothing that crazy. By the way, I think that Lost Ark is a garbage game, but if I'm trying to be objective, the boss fights in this game are just bloody amazing. Literally everything else outside of boss fights is garbage, but there you go. And yeah, I know this is not exactly a Diablo-like game, it's an MMORPG, but it plays like a Diablo-like RPG with MMO features on top of it. The mechanics of these boss fights are just on another level, and I would definitely expect future Diablo-like RPGs to have similar boss mechanics. That's why I'm kinda worried about Diablo 4, even though the gameplay clips look very good for that game. Anyway, the boss fights in Titan Quest are definitely a big step in difficulty compared to regular mobs in the game. The majority of abilities which bosses are using can be avoided by just positioning and kiting, but a lot of them also have some unavoidable abilities that will hit you no matter what. These kinds of abilities are usually called gear checks, which means that if you don't have strong enough equipment, you'll die no matter what. And again, this is mostly for higher difficulties in the game. You won't exactly get one-shotted on the normal difficulty when you get hit by these abilities. I was never a huge fan of unavoidable damage in fights, because it always feels extremely cheap. Anyway, to truly experience some serious challenge in Titan Quest, you will need to unlock new difficulties by beating the game. Higher difficulties require you to optimize your gear and build a lot better compared to the normal difficulty. It's not a perfect way to do difficulties, but the majority of Diablo-like action RPGs used to work like this. I think this trend started to die out a little bit in recent years. Path of Exile used to have cruel and merciless difficulty levels, and then it became a single 10-act playthrough game. Even Grim Dawn has a way to jump through difficulty levels by using a particular item. And I'm pretty sure that Diablo 4 won't have the same difficulty levels like Diablo 3. While having multiple difficulties in these types of games is not a perfect way to balance
O,
out the
dobrze,
game,
bardzo dobrze,
I'm
niech
still
to
not
wyskakuje.
entirely convinced that alternative methods are better. To sum it up, the default difficulty of Titan Quest is pretty decent. It's not too hard or too easy, and it managed to stay challenging throughout the campaign. The character progression system gives you a good feel of your power level going up from leveling and finding new items. Speaking of items, you have some important things to loot besides armors and weapons. Titan Quest has many different charms, which are used for creating a powerful item. You'll always get these charms in pieces, so you have to combine a couple of them to fully complete the charm. Then you can use them with different formulas, which can create a powerful item, which will boost your power level quite a bit. If you got used to games like Grim Dawn and Path of Exile, you're probably going to think that gameplay systems in Titan Quest are a lot simpler. I don't think that's a bad thing though. Sure, Titan Quest doesn't have a huge constellation system like Grim Dawn, or insane passive tree like Path of Exile, but it still offers you a lot of different ways to play your character. The modern design of Diablo-like action RPGs can be really intimidating for new players of this genre. That's why I think that Titan Quest is an amazing starting point if you wish to get into this genre. When it comes to new expansions, the Ragnarok is easily my personal favorite. But to be honest, all of them just feel like an additional reason to come back to the game for another playthrough. That doesn't mean that THQ didn't think about the endgame activities. The Eternal Embers, which was the last DLC for the game, is exclusive for level 70 characters. But if you don't have a high level character already and you want to experience this new piece of content, you can just make a level 70 character. Same goes for Ragnarok DLC, you can make a new level 40 character and jump right in. The only problem with this, and it's actually a big problem, is the equipment or the lack of it. If this is your first character, you obviously don't have any gear in the storage, and hard difficulties are pretty harsh, especially for a character with no freaking gear. THQ Nordic kinda had this in mind, so they included some epic gear in the first 2 chests of Eternal Embers DLC. But still, if you're a new player, you will get stomped on regardless of this because you don't know what you're doing. It's not exactly an ideal solution, and that's one of the reasons for a lot of negative reviews on Steam. The other reason why Atlantis and Eternal Embers are not so well received on Steam are technical issues.
8 poziom,
The
kurwa.
quality of these DLCs in general, I guess. The content in these DLCs is definitely not amazing, but I wouldn't call it bad. Some people call them a nostalgia bait and a cash grab. I wouldn't go so far, because for this to be the case, the quality of the new content has to be a real challenge, and I don't think that's the case.
Dobra, będę miał 10 poziom,
Although they're
kurwa
not
jego
exactly
mać.
very good. Like I said before, there are good enough reason for another playthrough of Titan Quest, especially if you played this game a long time ago. More locations and new monsters to kill is the way I think of them, to be honest. I did enjoy the switch to Norse mythology in the Ragnarok DLC quite a bit, and the Atlantis DLC has some really pretty locations. Putting Eternal Embers aside, THQ did include some new content that's aimed towards high-level characters. The Atlantis DLC added a horde mode called Tartarus. To be honest, I was never a huge fan of horde modes in general, so I don't really like it, but it's a good way to farm some unique gear if that's your thing. I prefer to play the campaign and do boss runs. Speaking of that, each DLC has a brand new campaign to go through and new regions to discover. Most of the new regions are looking amazing. New DLCs also added a couple of new masteries that you can try out, like Naden and Rune Master. Like I said before, my character is the mix of hunting and Naden mastery, but I'm not a huge fan of this mix. I only figured that out very late in the playthrough. Naden seems like a very boring mastery, to be honest. Rune Master seems like a much more interesting mastery, but don't quote me on that, because I still didn't try it out. Here's a little tip for trying out the mastery combinations. Just go ahead and make a new level 70 character if you have the Eternal Embers DLC, or level 40 character if you only have Ragnarok DLC, and test out the masteries a bit. To sum up the DLCs, Ragnarok feels like a full-blown expansion and is the best in my opinion. Atlantis is probably the worst out of all 3 DLCs because it kinda feels underdeveloped, but it probably has the most beautiful zones to explore, and some people might like the new horde mode it offers. I personally was not a huge fan. I still didn't form a complete opinion about Eternal Embers DLC because I'm still playing through it. I still don't know how to feel about the expansion that's exclusive to legendary difficulty. It's a ballsy decision to say the least. You would think it's a huge fan service to OG players of the game, but it's not exactly a good idea to disregard everyone else. It's a terrible idea actually. The bottom line is, I would suggest to get the anniversary edition of the game, and if you like it enough once you're done with the campaign, get Ragnarok DLC first. You can always choose to get the next 2 DLCs after that if you want to get more content. The music in the game is pretty damn good, even amazing sometimes, depending on the track. I selected a couple of my favorite songs from the game as a background for this video, but you'll get to hear a lot more amazing soundtracks in the game. All of the soundtracks are very fitting, which the zone you're exploring are trying to depict. So besides the visuals, the music is also responsible for creating a very nice atmosphere in the game, of course. I wish I could say the same for sound effects, but they are decent at best. The sound effects in combat don't lack that oomph, which gives the attacks a nice sense of weight. But the general quality of the sound effects is decent at best, like I said. They managed to make the low health sound effect very depressing, at least that's how it sounds to me. I already mentioned the voice acting before, it's average at best.
This isn't the first petition I've received requesting assistance. These beasts are everywhere.
My mana is gone.
You won't get to hear a ton of voice acting though, because the quests are few and far between. It's good enough to not ruin your experience and to break the monotony of killing things every once in a while. Literally 0 memorable characters though.
And a hero yet takes the bet to break the evil's fetter.
Titan Quest will always be one of those games that I like to revisit from time to time for another playthrough. Even after 16 years, this game looks pretty to look at and the gameplay is still very decent. Sure, the gameplay systems are not that complex like in Grim Dawn or Path of Exile, but it still manages to offer an enjoyable character progression. Thanks to the dual mastery system, which is by itself a huge reason to replay the game over and over again, just to try out a different builds. We're probably never going to see a sequel for this game, and that makes me really sad. Grim Dawn is the closest thing to a sequel because the game works on the same engine, so I would highly recommend checking it out when you're done with Titan Quest. Anyway, tell me your opinion about Titan Quest in the comments below. Do you plan to revisit the game in the current year and maybe try out these new DLCs? Or maybe you plan to try out the game for the first time ever? Leave a comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits, as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.
Siema Marcel, kurczę bole. Jak tam żyjesz?
Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Larian is a very interesting and ambitious studio. Ever since their humble beginnings, it was very obvious that the main goal of this studio was to make a fun game.
I know you want to make the perfect game! This is not the way!
Whether that's Diablo-like RPG, third-person action RPG, or turn-based tactical RPG. And whatever this was,
What a nincompoop.
this studio was never afraid to experiment with their games, which is not something you can say for a lot of game studios. But it seems like they found a sweet spot with the Divinity Original Sin series, and they just continue the same design philosophy with Baldur's Gate 3. While I personally would like to see another third-person action RPG from Larian, I highly doubt that will ever happen. When it comes to the game, which is the main topic of this video, a lot of people don't even know it exists, unfortunately. I'm willing to bet that some of you who clicked on this video will expect to see Original Sin 2 review.
Go on, keep moving.
Larian wasn't that creative with the title of these games, up to the point where they had to put a disclaimer on Steam if you accidentally end up on this page. It's a jumbled mess, and it's kinda sad actually, because this game deserved a lot better.
I'm flattered, but I'm afraid this is neither the time nor the place for frivolities and frolics.
Divinity 2 Ego Draconis came out in 2009 for PC and Xbox 360. The reception of this game was decent, but it definitely got overlooked.
Jak on zapierdala, co jest?
Unfortunately, Larian wasn't
Bagieta.
able to change this, even though they re-released the game a couple of times. Shortly after the release of one and only DLC for the game called Flames of Vengeance, they released the Dragon Knight Saga. This was basically the complete package where we get the base game along with the DLC, but Larian also included a huge balancing patch within this package. It had a lot of changes to the base game based on community feedback. And then finally we got Developer's Cut in the late 2012. This version of the game allows you to enable cheats and play around with various aspects of the game that were inaccessible before. This is the only digital version of the game that you can get today on your PC, by the way. That being said, I don't think that changing the name of the game was a good idea because it only makes things more confusing. So nowadays we have two completely different games by the same studio with the same name, kinda. It's really dumb, but it is what it is. But what about the game itself, People G? Is it really good? Well, I'm glad you asked.
But I will wait words on you no longer.
Divinity 2 starts off with a cutscene that doesn't tell you much. There is this bald guy who is obviously evil and a guy with sparkly eyes chasing a dragon. There is no voice acting in this cutscene or any explanation at all. Shortly after this cutscene you get to make your own character. The character customization is extremely limited, up to the point where it almost feels pointless, to be honest. No matter which options you pick, you'll get to meet at least a couple of same looking characters in the first 15 minutes of the game. But you're going to wear a helmet all the time, so who cares anyway? I'm not saying that the game doesn't have unique looking characters, but they're few and far between. Those unique models are reserved for a couple of very important characters, which is understandable when you have to cut some corners. Everyone else looks like they have a bunch of evil clones running around. To be honest, I don't really care that much, especially because the game is really silly in general. For the most part, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and those moments will probably be the highlights of your experience if you plan to play this game.
What's the matter with you? You look like you've seen a ghost.
However, the main story of the game has a more serious tone, and unfortunately it falls flat to its face in those segments for a couple of reasons that we're going to talk about. I think Larian got a lot better when it comes to storytelling with their newer games. They kept the same writing style in Original Sin, and the humor is still the most prominent aspect of those games. The only major difference between Divinity 2 and Original Sin games when it comes to this is the effectiveness of the story itself, when it needs to be more serious. Original Sin games are much better on this field. They manage to tell a compelling story that gets really dark at times while still retaining most of the humor from prior games. Divinity 2 is not that convincing with those serious parts of the story, and one of the major reasons for that is the underwhelming antagonist. You know, the bald guy from the initial cutscene called Damien, and he's the guy you need to stop from destroying the world.
Realize that all you do is in vain. The pieces are set, and the game is about to begin.
While the premise of the main story just screams cliché, the actual story itself is pretty interesting. And there are definitely some memorable characters that you're going to meet throughout the game. By the way, you don't have to worry about any major spoilers in this video, although I will have a separate section in the video where I discuss the ending of the game and some other major spoilers. I'll make sure you can skip that part of the video if you wish by clicking on the timestamp, so don't worry. Anyway, the main story has a couple of interesting twists and turns, and the first one happens right after the tutorial section of the game. You start off as the member of an elite soldier unit called the Dragon Slayers. The name of this unit should give you a hint what they're all about. On the other side we have Dragon Knights, the chosen champions of real dragons who can transform into, well, dragons. The Slayers had been hunting Dragon Knights for God knows how long, because they killed Lucian the Divine. Lucian the Divine was actually the player character from the first Divinity game, Divine Divinity. Oh yeah, by the way, about 5 months ago I asked my community what's the RPG with the worst name, and Divine Divinity came at the top in more than a few top comments. Anyway, you don't get to learn a lot about the story from the tutorial section though. Commander Rhodes is the first person you talk with, and she tells you to talk with another Slayer in the village, so you can complete the initiation. You can probably tell what kind of experience you can expect from the story from just speaking to people in the village. At the very beginning, almost every dialogue line that you can select is filled with jokes and references.
Here lies Sleepy Joe, doing what he does best.
This persists through the whole game, and more than often it gets really ridiculous.
You are starting to vex me, servant of the servant.
And this time I'll see you in pieces once more, prostitute of the pervert. What the fuck?
The tongue is still sharp as always.
The game made me laugh out loud in some dialogue situations, and that's always a big plus in my book. As for the references, a lot of them are kinda subtle, but some of them are really aggressive. You'll find references to movies, TV shows, and other games. Valerian just didn't hold back when it comes to this, and it kinda fits with the silly mood of the game.
Titus! Rock them! Obelis! Retta!
Go, go, Power Ranger! Crackosaurus!
Co to kurwa jest?
Expect a lot of dark humor as well, which
Go,
is
go,
surprising.
Power
A
Rangers!
big part of the game is about necromancers and zombies, so what's not to like?
Ale na
It
kurwie
might
to
not
mowa.
be everyone's cup of tea, but I enjoyed it immensely. Because I'm a sick son of a bitch. The dialogue itself is presented very well. You only get a couple of sentences from all NPCs, and all the extra information is usually optional. Unless we're talking
Kurwa, już
about
R
a
chciałem
really
wcisnąć,
important
żeby
part of the
biegła.
main story, where NPCs
Pozdro.
usually have a bit longer monologues, but that doesn't happen that often. On the other side of the spectrum, we have something that's not so optional: unskippable cutscenes. Yeah, it's one of the most annoying things you have to deal with in this game. It's especially annoying if you play this game on higher difficulties like I did. I kinda feel the need to tell you this even before we get to the gameplay parts. You should absolutely avoid hard and nightmare difficulties, but we'll get to that. You're pretty much forced to manually save the game right after the cutscene ends, which can put you in a huge disadvantage sometimes when a fight is about to happen. To make things even worse, your character always sheathes his weapons in a cutscene, so by the time you get your weapons ready, you usually get blasted in the face before the fight even begins. You take some really cheap damage because of this. And I don't think I have to spend a lot of time trying to explain why unskippable cutscenes are a huge problem. The game does have an autosave feature, but it's not very good. I highly recommend saves coming with a quick save button if you want to preserve your sanity. Anyway, to conclude the dialogue part, I always look forward to speaking with NPCs just to see what kind of dumb shit
Stonehenge.
If you expect to experience some deep conversations and very engaging storytelling, you'll probably get disappointed. Although the game does have a decent lore, I guess, which was heavily expanded in original Sin games. Speaking of which, let's continue with the main story. Becoming a Dragon Slayer comes with a couple of useful perks. Some of them are cosmetic, like the grey eyes, while others give you the ability to read minds and see ghosts of long dead people. Shortly after the game begins, you'll get all of the mentioned abilities by officially turning into a Dragon Slayer. Then the game makes up a really poor excuse for starting as a fresh level 1 character. Apparently you have been training for years to become a Slayer, and all of that will be lost once you accept the gift of becoming one.
The real drawback is this. The spell was not originally designed for the brain of a human. So to make place for it, you will lose your active knowledge of your years as a Slayer.
Yeah, sounds like a great excuse. Anyway, the tutorial section of the game allows you to try out 3 different styles of combat. This only gets you one starting ability and a weapon, but the game has a classless system in general, so you can mix and match abilities however you want. We'll talk about that when we get to the gameplay section soon enough. The ability to read minds is the most unique feature you get as a Dragon Slayer. Being able to see ghosts is like whatever, you're going to fight and meet a ton of them throughout the game.
What the jakie kurwy.
And speaking of
Ostockie.
ghosts, this is one of the parts where you can see the lack of budget for this game. The same model for the ghost is used for pretty much every other ghost you're going to see in the game. And I'm not a huge fan of this design, because it looks bizarre for the sake of being bizarre. It's not a big deal, but it's worth mentioning. As for the mind reading, you can find a lot of useful information from people like this. Not just from people, but pretty much all creatures you can speak with in the game. For example, you can find out the location of the key for the chest, or some useful information about particular quest you took. Or in some cases you get extra ability point to spend, which is really useful. There is a slight penalty for experience points.
Kurwa z tego, z Diablo.
Ability, but it's not a huge deal.
4.
Although it could be a problem if you try and read everyone's mind, and it will affect the process of leveling up. So yeah, the mind read ability is the bigger part of the game in general. Right after the tutorial section, you and all other Slayers end up in the Broken Valley. There has been sightings of a Dragon Knight Talana, who's
War inside my head.
Dragon Knight in general. Commander
War
Roll,
inside my
simple
head.
tasks in the village. You need to ask around if anyone saw the dragon, and then you have to kill some skeletons in the crypts. And right after you complete those initial main quests, she's like,
No
"Okay, I'm
weźmiemy.
going to go and kill the dragon while you wait at the village because you are still a noob slayer." What's interesting about this main quest, and a lot of other main quests actually, is the quest notes in the journal, or the lack of them. It's like you don't have a main quest at all, just because you're not supposed to do anything, according to Commander Rhodes. At least that's how I interpreted this. A bunch of other main quests you get throughout the game will work the same, you'll just have to figure out how things work by yourself. But the game has quest marks, and I'm still not entirely sure how they work. The location for the main quest is usually visible on the map, while the majority of side quests won't have any indication, unless they do, sometimes. It's very inconsistent. You shouldn't expect to rely on quest marks that much, because even when the game points you in the direction where you need to go, you usually have to do something extra in order to continue. If you watch my RPG reviews, you'll probably know that I personally prefer when you have to discover things by yourself, so I don't have any problems with this.
Speak the word
As the
so
prey
that you
grows
may
more
pass.
fierce, so
Oh,
must the
yes,
huntress.
indeed.
Another really impressive thing about this particular quest is the item you get as a reward. The same quest item can be used in a couple of different ways throughout the game, and some other quests as well. It's not like the game tells you this, you can only discover it by yourself. I won't spoil anything though, but it left a lasting impression on me, so I had to mention it. Speaking of that, there are a bunch of lootable items that you have to interact with in order to complete particular quests. And a lot of quests in the game are overlapping, which means that the questing system is a lot deeper than it might seem at first. Although the game has a lot of quests that try to test the player, of which I'm not particularly fond of. That's because of the trial and error nature of those quests, because you'll eventually get them right, even randomly.
I'm afraid not.
However, the game also has quests that you can fail if you get them wrong, which is a great deal.
Okej, no już kliknąłem, chuj tam.
There are not a ton of quests like this, but it's still appreciated. And what's perhaps the most important thing when it comes to quests, you always have at least a couple of different ways to complete them. The consequences for your decisions in quest solving are well designed as well. These quests usually have a very different...
Boże, ale się boję tych kurwa, naprawdę, one są takie straszne. Razem pokażę, kogoś się boję. Te białe takie stworki. Kurwa, jak się boję tego. Boję, no tak.
This was just an optional side room of the dungeon.
O te, kurwa, jak one nie straszą.
And you can resolve this quest peacefully by
One
getting him to
wpierdalają
chicken
tam
rooms,
swoich.
which allows him to have unlimited fried chicken. There are many fun and crazy quests like this, but I won't spoil it for you.
Sick transit Gloria Monday!
That one doesn't work either.
However, the main quest is completely linear. When it comes to the story itself, it's always the same outcome. But even some main quests have different options that you have to pick, even though they don't exactly affect the main story. Speaking of the main story, once you continue the main quest, you'll find Dragon Knight Talana at the brink of death. And we could say that this is where the main story actually begins. Captain Gold was responsible for inflicting the mortal wound to Talana. But right before she dies, she managed to turn you into a Dragon Knight, because your mind is still vulnerable from becoming a Slayer. I mean, it was pretty easy to figure out that eventually your character would be able to turn into a dragon. Hit some of them blocks of the game, by the way. But I still like this little story twist, even though it was very predictable. From this point on, you get to hear Talana's voice inside your head, and she will guide you to the rest of the story, in a way.
You are a dragon. Show that cursed lot the might of the ancient race. Burn their flesh and topple their tyrants.
Her ultimate mission was to kill Damien because she saw the future, and what kind of destruction will Damien bring if he's not stopped? So this becomes your main mission, and you go through various main quests to figure out how to stop Damien. With the help of Talana and some new characters you'll meet along the way, like Zandalor, who claims to be a protector of Dragon Knights. I can't really go deeper than this without spoiling anything major, so to conclude my spoiler-free thoughts about the main story, it was interesting to see what's going to happen next, and some characters are very memorable. However, I despise the ending of the main story, which I won't spoil here of course. Like I said before, Damien is a really weak antagonist. You start seeing him a lot after you turn into a Dragon Knight, and he always behaves like the cringiest bad guy from a low-budget action movie.
I shall finally remove the pawn that is blocking my offensive. Farewell then. It has been a pleasure.
I'll leave the rest of this discussion for the spoiler section of the video.
Ja pierdolę.
Before we get to the gameplay part of the video, let's talk about the visuals. I already touched upon the character models a bit and the obvious lack of resources. I mean, Divinity 2 wasn't a AAA RPG by any means. Larian was a much smaller studio back then. On the other side, I have to give a lot of credit to Larian when it comes to other parts of the character models. You're going to see a lot of cool armor sets and NPCs, and more importantly, you'll be able to acquire a bunch of unique armor sets. I would argue this is even more important to get right, at least from the gameplay perspective. As someone who holds visual progression in high regard, I was quite satisfied how Divinity 2 handled this. When it comes to graphics in general, I always had very mixed feelings about this game. The graphical fidelity is obviously not the strongest aspect of this game, especially today after 13 years. But even when the game came out, the visual experience was quite impressive. If you watch my reviews, you probably know that the artistic style of the game is always a lot more important to me. The art style is not exactly unique, it's actually quite generic, but not in a bad way if you ask me. To put it this way, it's enough for me to recognize this game by just watching a random screenshot. But that's pretty much everything I have to say about the art style. However, we have to point out some very bad parts about the visuals of this game. This is mostly related to the lack of detail in a couple of major locations that you're going to explore. A lot of these locations in the game look visually flat and devoid of any detail, especially the ground clutter. Even the areas which have a lot more detailed terrain are not that great to look at. This is some very basic visual style all around. The Broken Valley is definitely the best looking location in the game, and it feels the most developed in general. The island looks extremely boring to me, and it's easily the worst looking area in the game. Orobas Fjords is just a little bit better, even though this zone has a strong reason for such different design compared to other zones. That's still not an excuse for looking extremely generic though. I played the game on the high settings and 4K resolution, and most of the textures are pretty crisp, but occasionally you're going to stumble upon some very low res textures. I think the interiors look way superior to open areas in general. Larian managed to cram a lot of details in these dungeons, houses, and pretty much every other instance area that you're going to explore. Open areas just feel very lifeless, except the first village and the city of Alarot in the DLC, I guess. Lighting in the game is extremely basic, the trees are static, and there is no day and night cycle. Instead, you get these awkward scenery transitions when the game tries to set up particular moves. That's not bad per se, but it's not very good either. Wow, it sounds like I hate the game or something, but I actually don't, trust me. As for the performance, I had zero issues with the frame rate on highest details and 4K resolution. Just prefer to cap the frame rate of the game on 60 within your GPU drivers and disable it in the game menu. Otherwise, you'll get the feeling like the environment is laggy when you turn your camera. Now let's finally talk about the gameplay.
Jak to się robiło?
Like I said before, I
Dało się to
always felt
przesuwać,
like
tylko to
Big
trzeba...
Wall
Aha,
is
z
still
strzałkami,
a fun
dobra.
game. Even before you
Można
get
tu
the
iść
weapon in
na
the
górę.
beginning, you can mess around
Tu
with
jaką
the
górę?
system
Co ja
and
pierdolę?
cook chickens to death. You'll immediately notice
Na
some
dół.
over-the-top animations and more than generous
Tego
jumping
typu.
ability. Actually, the jumping becomes a lot better when you become a Dragon Knight shortly after the
Oh,
beginning of the
cool.
game. I just love jumping.
Dragon
in this game,
Knight.
and this is pretty much how I explore the world. Yeah, walking normally is for losers. Anyway, the combat in Divinity 2 is fast-paced, but you also have a tactical pause button, which I never use that much to be honest. The most useful function of this feature is to automatically pause the game when your health is low, so you can heal. But you can also issue commands from the pause menu if you wish. The feel of the combat is decent, and I always have a lot of fun with trying out different abilities and
Bo jeszcze
mixing
wpierdalają
matches with
swoich.
unique builds. However, there are some parts of this combat system which are pretty bad, up to the point where it almost made me quit this playthrough because I got really mad. But you shouldn't get turned off by this, because this is mostly a critique for the Nightmare difficulty. I played almost the entire game on Nightmare, which was probably the worst decision I made when it comes to this game. It's absolutely an awful way of doing a difficult move in a game of this type, and I highly recommend playing it on normal. Trust me, you'll thank me later. I don't want to sound like I hate the gameplay in this game, because I don't. I think it's pretty fun in general, and it's one of the reasons why you should give this game a chance if you never played it before. So let's focus on the good stuff first. Getting stronger in this game and the whole progression system in general is really good. Leveling up always gives you a considerable power boost, no matter where you choose to dump your ability points. You also have classic RPG stat points which are contribute. If you're wondering if these stat points are actually important to keep in mind, I can assure you they are. Most of the time you die in combat, there is a big chance that some of your stats are low. Especially these stats right here.
Remove all burning when
Difficulty is
ignite.
more unforgiving when it comes to this, but you should still pay attention to your character stats, even on normal. The thing is, even though the game has an action combat system, you can
Dobra.
rely 100% on your mechanical abilities.
Kiedy znowu Need for Speed?
Jumping will allow you to avoid 80% of attacks,
Jutro może?
but this is a game where you can't avoid
Siemanko.
getting hit, no matter which playstyle you choose.
No, wyszła nowa liga i myślę sobie, że
They allow you to mitigate a lot of damage.
warto byłoby tak, kurde, ciupnąć, obczaić co i jak, bo grałem na standardowej pierwszy raz i było ciekawie, no. Jeszcze muszę skończyć w ogóle tą postać, bo mam 70 chyba 5 poziom, ale to jest bardzo słabe. No jak na ten poziom, XPP.
Mainly because the majority of actions in combat have long animation lock, whether that's regular attacks, using abilities, pulling out your weapons, or getting hits. All of those actions will make you lose the control of your character, and there is no way to cancel your actions. This game has a soft lock-on system that functions pretty well. Switching between enemies is almost seamless, no matter which weapon you use. You just have to face the center of the camera at the enemy. I always prefer the soft lock-on system instead of a more traditional lock-on which plays with your camera.
Zacznę od tego powiedzienia.
I wanted to focus on
11 poziom, no.
range abilities with the bow. The game has a very useful switch for 3 different weapon sets of your choice. This is probably the most seamless feature in the combat system because there is zero delay when you switch your weapons. You can even do it while jumping. What's even better when it comes to this, the game is smart enough to automatically equip a corresponding weapon type when you use your abilities. So for example, you can shoot your arrows with your bow and use range abilities. But if you try to use some melee abilities while shooting with a bow, the game will automatically switch to your previously selected weapon slot and seamlessly cast the ability. This definitely deserves some praise because it's a great feature. So you don't have to worry about mixing mage, ranger, and warrior abilities. Everything you cast is seamless. The skill tree offers you a pretty decent amount of active and passive abilities. There are no restrictions when it comes to getting these abilities, as long as your level is high enough. But naturally, your most effective abilities will be the ones that synergize with the stats you increase upon leveling up, as well as the gear you have, of course. all abilities work off mana, so no matter which playstyle you go for, your mana is going to be the primary resource. There are some skills you can get which makes this a lot easier, like mana leech, but you're still going to have a lot of mana problems, at least I did on nightmare difficulty. I don't hate this part of the combat design, but I don't like it either. If there is even a slightly longer fight, you're always going to have mana problems, even as a pure melee character. Later in the game, potions become a lot more accessible, so it's not a huge issue. There is a way to make potions if you have the ingredients, even before you unlock the battle tower, which is your main hub area. But
Czemu siła? No ja
huge damage
pierdolę.
using the mana for everything you cast. The combat itself is not exactly impactful and weighty, it's definitely more on the floaty side. The animations for the melee combo are really fun though. The nature of this combat system leans a bit too much on spamming normal attacks, but it still manages to feel fun if you ask me. Even though you can use dodge and use jump to avoid getting hit, there are no actual iframes. That means that you always have to be physically out of the reach to avoid getting hit. Invincibility frames would be a lot better choice, and it could have potentially saved the game from some problems which are very prominent. So let's talk about those problems, shall we? If I would have to point my finger at the worst feature slash mechanic in this action combat system, that would be the unavoidable damage. Instead of talking a lot, let me just show you. Doesn't seem very fun, does it? There is a certain spell which most enemies use that will always hit you. No matter if you're out of the reach, behind an object or whatever, you're always getting hit. This spell is so overused, it almost ruins the whole game. The majority of bosses you're going to fight in the game also have this fucking spell. The thing is, it's not even the damage from the spell that's annoying. Do you remember what I said before about the animation lock? Whenever you get hit by this spell or some other ability, your character gets staggered, and that opens up the window for enemies to do some serious damage to you.
My wounds are grave.
You're always going to fight multiple enemies in the game, so this was always a problem to me. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. I guess it's a lot less frustrating on normal difficulty, but that's not an excuse. Speaking of boss fights, they didn't age so well. The game's idea of doing difficult boss fights is to summon a bunch of regular enemies as well. It's a very cheap way of increasing the difficulty of the fight because the bosses don't have any unique abilities. It's pretty much the same ability pool that your character can use, they hit hard and they have a lot of health. Fighting Ball was the most frustrating experience in the game until I figured out I can aggro these fuckers one at a time. Then it was a pretty easy fight even on Nightmare, but this just proves my points. On the bright side, the game has a decent amount of different looking enemies to fight. The goblins are a bit overused though.
Lower prices mean less gold, but more sales.
Kurwa no, Jezus, kupsko takie, że...
When it comes to the dragon gameplay, it's more of a gimmick than anything else to be honest. Although the second major area of the game is completely designed around this feature. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not a bad experience, but the whole dragon form is revolved around destroying towers and occasionally killing some dragons with a single button. Flying around in the second area is really fun though, but this place is not nearly big enough to justify the flying mechanic. It's obvious that Larian was a little bit too ambitious when it comes to this idea. You have a separate skill tree for the dragon, but it's completely pointless if you ask me. I would prefer if Larian designed all areas for the human form, to be honest. You can still use the human form in all locations, but this area is obviously designed around the dragon form, which kinda hinders the exploration outside of it. So like
zróbmy takie coś, myślę.
way too ambitious, and that's probably the main reason why it feels so underdeveloped. Judging by the DLC, Larian also thinks that the dragon form was a hit and miss feature. 99% of the DLC is designed around the human form, so you be the judge. Fun fact, there was supposed to be another form which was halfway between the dragon and human forms, and that form was supposed to be very powerful for fighting on the ground. This is really interesting, and once again you can see how ambitious Larian was. Speaking about underdeveloped features,
Curse is single and no nie, to bez sensu.
Quite late in the game. Actually, I wouldn't call the battle tower underdeveloped, it was just introduced very late in the game. The battle tower is your hub area where you have the complete list of
Dash,
features
no to
as
też
the
się
game
przyda,
offers.
dash.
You can store items, mix potions, enchant armors and weapons, and even create your own monster from various body parts you loot. This is a
On
very
mnie
cool feature
rucha,
actually, that you can
a ja
unlock
jestem
even before you get a
szumka.
tower. Your monster gets different abilities depending on which body parts you choose. So even if you don't decide to invest points into summoning creatures, you will have at least one loyal monster. The only problem with this has nothing to do with the feature itself. The AI for the monster is pretty bad. More than often, he can just decide to not show up in a fight because he's bored or something. It also doesn't help at all that all enemies on the screen will usually attack you all the time. But the Necromancer is not the only one. You can find people in the Broken Valley who can offer you all of these services which the Battle Tower has. The Battle Tower just puts everything together and it makes things a lot more convenient. The Battle Tower is a really cool concept and I love the way it looks. But you can only unlock this place after about 15 or even 20 hours of gameplay, depending on how you play, of course. And after you unlock the tower, you can get around 20 more hours of gameplay at best from the rest of the game, not counting the DLC. If you ask me, I think the Battle Tower system would work a lot better if you get to unlock it early in the game. But by itself, it's a really cool hub area that you can teleport to anytime you want. When it comes to the world design, I think it's pretty solid all around. Like I said before, the interiors are way superior to open areas in the game. Most of the fun things you get to do in the game are happening inside dungeons and closed areas. You'll find a lot of optional puzzles to solve, which usually give you a very good item. The game has a decent amount of jumping puzzles, and that's great because jumping is really fun in this game. Exploring open areas in the game is still fun because you can find a lot of secrets and some interesting quests. What makes the exploration more dangerous and more exciting, if you ask me, is the lack of any level scaling. That means that all enemies have fixed levels, which can render some locations inaccessible until you get stronger. I think this creates a normal leveling up experience, despite all of the problems I mentioned with the combat. I personally really prefer this over level scaling in general. The last thing I want to mention is something that I only touched upon early in the video. The itemization in the game is really satisfying and you'll have a lot of weapons and armors to loot. Especially when it comes to set items, which more than often have a lot of individual pieces in the set, like lava pieces. I'm pretty sure that most set items are not random drops, but you will be able to buy some of them at certain merchants. However, the game introduces some very high quality non-set items later in the game. But I wouldn't say they exactly make the set items obsolete, since some of the bonuses you get from completing the set are really strong. Completing the set items is another thing which makes the replay value of the game stronger. The replay value of the game is pretty decent in general, even though the main story itself always stays the same. And speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about some spoilers. You can skip this part by pressing the next timestamp in the video. I was really disappointed with how the game ended, and I know a lot of people felt the same. It's probably pointless to bitch about this now because the DLC just continues where the main game ended. That's also why I don't really want to talk about this DLC, since we're going to spoil the whole game for people who didn't play it. Anyway, you have been lied to ever since you became a Dragon Knight. The voice inside your head was not from Talana, it was from Damien's wife all along. You were basically just her puppet and she used you to get her life back by altering the history and stopping her from getting killed. So in the end, your character gets trapped in the void for eternity, along with Lucian the Divine, who is actually alive. Yeah, you're not dead, you're just trapped in this place. I wouldn't mind the main story that much if we had the chance to figure out that Talana is not the person who is guiding us. That would open up the possibility for multiple endings, and if that was the case,
Hearts of Iron.
main story in general.
Hearts of Iron. O, chcę przejść tutaj, to jeszcze muszę do Mad Flats, tak? Kurwa. Kurwa! Widzicie, właśnie coś mi się tak kurwa czasami dzieje. Dziwnie. O, dobra. Kurwysyny.
And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Damien really sucks. He's a very generic bad guy who had the chance to kill you God knows how many times in the main story. If he actually knew the plans of his wife, keeping you alive would make more sense, but he didn't know this, as we can see from the final cutscene.
I battled tirelessly to release you from death's grip, and here you are, alive and free without my help. How?
So it just makes him stupid and boring. As for the DLC, it's a lot more satisfying conclusion to the main story. You actually get to kill Yirna, which was really satisfying. But Flames of Vengeance DLC leaves a lot to be desired. The city of Alaroth has interesting quests, and some of them are even better than most quests from the base game. But you're pretty much stuck in here. I don't like being
Evasion
stuck
rating.
in one location, especially if the game had open areas. Larian kinda gave up on the dragon form in this DLC, even though you still get to use it every once in a while in some very linear sections. The DLC will automatically start when you finish the main game, so it doesn't even feel like a DLC nowadays. The city is fun to explore, but not so fun to justify the whole DLC that's based around it. The locations from the base game are not accessible because of what happened in the story, but that's still not a good excuse to completely limit your movement to this single location. I still enjoyed it quite a lot since I love the game in general. Before we wrap this up, let's take a moment to talk about the sound design. I love the soundtrack for this game, even though there are some tracks which seem out of place a bit. The Broken Valley has a really chill soundtrack and it's definitely my favorite. The sound effects are a hit and miss, but they are serviceable. The majority of combat sound effects are really sharp, which is a bit off-putting to me. Like I said before, the combat lacks the feeling of weight, and the sound effects are not helping at all, but I heard a lot worse. The voice acting has a really special charm to it. I could recognize this game by just listening to some random voice lines in my sleep, and that has to mean something, right? That's probably because of the writing itself, but
Aspect
the
of
voices
an
in
eagle.
are decent for the most part.
Seek out the men and women who reside here and benefit from their knowledge.
Sure, you're going to find some characters with very silly voices, but even those are quite charming if you ask me.
Peggy acts like she's a natural blonde. Who does she think she's fooling?
I might be biased when it comes to this, so you be the judge. Although pretty much all important characters in the game have solid voice acting.
Yes, I can see the bloodlust in your eyes. So young and so designed to kill.
I was really curious about the Xbox 360 version of this game, so I had to try it out.
Boom.
There is no official controller support on the PC for some reason. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to play this game a bit on Xbox 360. And to be honest, the controller scheme is terrible on Xbox controller. I mean, you have to use the right trigger to jump, which is really awkward. You can map your abilities to A, B, Y, X and the D-pad, which is actually quite functional. But the most interesting part when it comes to controls is the active lock-on system. You might remember that I mentioned how PC version of the game only has a soft lock-on system, and how you can actually use a dedicated button to lock on the PC version as well. I don't believe I mentioned that. But even so, the PC version of the game just permanently highlights the enemy with the lock-on. However, the lock-on on the Xbox behaves like a traditional lock-on system, but you have to actively hold the left trigger and your character will circle around the target. This definitely changes the feel of the gameplay in general, but like I said, the control scheme is pretty awkward on Xbox. This version of the game has a certain charm to it though. The UI is obviously completely different and it's worse compared to the PC version, but I wouldn't say it's terrible. All features from the PC version are there, they're just presented differently. The zoomed-in camera was probably a technical limitation rather than a design choice, but I have to say I kinda like it. Unfortunately, the PC version doesn't have any camera controls. You just get a fixed angle and that's it. I would like to play with a more zoomed-in angle like this. That would be everything I consider interesting from this version of the game. If you decide to try out this game, you can now use my GOG link and you support my channel by doing so. I finally managed to set up my affiliate links with GOG, so pretty much every game that I review from now on will have my links to GOG store. I'm pretty sure Divinity 2 will be on a huge discount at the time of publishing this video. Even a lot of previous games that I covered in videos have GOG links in the description and usually in the pinned comments. I also have a Patreon page if you want to support my channel directly. Even the cheapest membership level means a lot for a small creator like myself. But hey, the best way to support the channel is actually free by just watching the video, pressing the thumbs up button and subscribing to the channel. That'll be all, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Piranha Bytes loves to make RPG trilogies. The newest game from this studio came out just a couple of months ago, and it was a direct sequel to Elex 1 from 2017. Judging by everything we know about the sequel and the history of the studio, we can say for sure that Elex 3 is inevitable.
To kurwa był. A może to jest na jakiś 5. poziom, czekajcie jakie to są... A 5. poziom. Ex kurwa pay.
Creating a brand new IP is always a big risk, even when it comes to AAA games, let alone a small budget RPG from a studio with around 30 people. But Piranha Bytes already established a very loyal fan base with Gothic games, even though Gothic 3 was considered to be a major disappointment, mainly because it felt unfinished. Then it got even worse with the awful standalone spin-off, which was The Forsaken Gods. Even though that game wasn't developed by Piranha Bytes, it only added more fuel to the fire which Gothic 3 started. It seemed like everything was going downhill until we got a brand new game from the studio. Reason was a chance for a new beginning. This game was something entirely new from the Gothic developer, but they kept the same design philosophy which made their previous games so beloved. In a lot of ways, Reason felt like Gothic 1 and 2, but in a different skin. It's maybe not the game which the fans wanted, but the game which the fans needed.
But isn't that terribly dangerous?
That's because people expected to see another Gothic game from the studio, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. Back then, Piranha Bytes lost the license for the Gothic IP, although only temporarily. The license went to Joe Wood, which was the ex-publisher of Gothic games. Joe Wood got the rights to develop a game within the Gothic universe, so they hired a new studio to make Arcania. But that's a totally different story that we're going to talk about in the next video. Making a completely new game was the only option for Piranha Bytes. It didn't seem like Reason was developed out of pure necessity. Judging by the general quality of this game, it seems like Piranha Bytes wanted to move on from the Gothic franchise anyway. However, Reason was not without its problems, and some of them are quite big, especially in later chapters. Ironically, I think it suffers from similar issues that Gothic 3 had when it comes to feeling unfinished. Despite that, I still believe it's very much worth playing today, especially if you never played it before. So we'll talk about the good, the bad, and everything I consider important about Reason 1 in this video. I completed a playthrough on my PC, and I also played the infamous Xbox 360 version just to see how bad it actually was. Yeah, I'm suffering so you don't have to. You're welcome.
Oh.
Now let's go back to the beginning and start analyzing every major aspect of this game.
You telling tales now?
The reception of Reason was pretty decent in general, even though it was far from being a highly anticipated game. Well, it was decent on the PC at least. Like I said, the Xbox 360 port was absolutely terrible, but we'll talk about this version of the game a bit later in the video. Reason starts with a short cutscene, which gives you a pretty vague introduction of what's going on in this world. Apparently, the gods were treating the people as slaves for a long time on this world, so people eventually managed to banish them. Banishing the gods set in motion the sudden appearance of temple ruins all over the world. The main story is heavily revolved around these temples, and you'll spend a lot of time exploring them in later chapters. And speaking of you, once again you get to control a nameless character, just like in Gothic games. There is basically no background story or any additional info about the character you play. It's entirely up to you to shape his personality through dialogue and different gameplay choices, which are quite prominent in this RPG. And even though the character customization system would fit perfectly with such RPG design, Piranha Bytes just refuses to include that feature in their games. I really think they don't realize how many people love customizing their own characters in RPGs. The last two games from this studio had a well-established main character with a rich backstory. When you have predetermined characters like Jax from Elex, Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher, and so on, the lack of any customization options is more forgiving. However, Greedfall, for example, also had a predetermined character, but that didn't stop the developer from including a comprehensive character customization system. I think it's a missed opportunity with Reason because this attract more people. Anyway, ever since the temples have risen from the ground,
Prisoner good, fucking good. Dobra, to już mnie kurwa przystało do fotela. Trzymajcie się cieplutko. Dance.